The winter of 1427 arrived in the north of England like a punishment long foretold. Snow fell upon the moors in sheets of white silence, burying the roads beneath drifts that reached the height of a man's chest, and the wind howled through the valleys with a voice that seemed almost human in its grief. It was in the heart of this frozen desolation that Eleanor Wren walked, her thin woolen cloak wrapped tight against the cold, her boots leaving trails in the snow that the wind erased almost as quickly as she made them. She had been walking for 3 days. Behind her lay the village of Thornbury, where she had spent the last 4 years as a servant in the household of Lord Garrett, a man whose cruelty had been matched only by his parsimony. She had scrubbed his floors, mended his linens, endured the casual violence of his temper and the wandering hands of his eldest son, and in return she had received a pallet of straw in a corner of the kitchen and scraps from the table that even the dogs refused. When Lord Garrett had announced his intention to sell her contract to a merchant in York, a man known throughout the county for his treatment of female servants, Eleanor had made her choice. She had stolen bread from the larder, coins from the household strongbox, and her own freedom from a life that had offered her nothing but suffering. Now, as the snow swirled around her and the cold seeped into her bones, she wondered if she had simply exchanged one form of death for another. The advertisement had been nailed to the door of a church in a village she had passed 2 days prior, its words nearly obscured by ice and neglect. Servant wanted for household of modest gentlemen. Room, board, and fair wages. Inquire at Ashworth Manor beyond the northern moors. The promise of fair wages had seemed almost fantastical, a dream conjured by desperation and hunger, but Eleanor had copied the directions onto a scrap of cloth and set out before dawn, driven by the knowledge that she had nowhere else to go. She crested a hill as the afternoon light began to fade, and there, in the valley below, she saw it. Ashworth Manor rose from the snow like something that had grown rather than been built, its gray stone walls blending with the winter sky until it was difficult to determine where architecture ended and nature began. It was smaller than she had expected, more fortress than manor, with thick walls and narrow windows that suggested centuries of conflict and defense. A single tower rose from its eastern corner, its peak lost in the low-hanging clouds, and smoke curled from chimneys that promised warmth within. Eleanor descended the hill with renewed determination, her frozen feet carrying her toward the promise of shelter. The gates of Ashworth stood open, their iron bars crusted with ice, and she passed through them without hesitation. The courtyard beyond was silent, empty save for a single horse tethered near the stables, its breath rising in clouds of vapor as it regarded her approach with mild curiosity. She knocked upon the manor's great oak door and waited. For a long moment, there was nothing but the whisper of wind and the distant call of ravens circling the tower. Then, with a groan of ancient hinges, the door swung inward, and Eleanor found herself face to face with a woman whose appearance seemed designed to intimidate. She was tall, perhaps 50 years of age, with silver hair pulled back from a face that bore the lines of a life spent in service. Her dress was plain but well made, the dark wool of a housekeeper who took pride in her position, and her eyes assessed Eleanor with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making swift judgments about character and capability. "You are the one who answered the advertisement." It was not a question. "Yes, madam. My name is Eleanor Wren. I have come seeking the position." "I know why you have come." The woman stepped aside, gesturing for Eleanor to enter. "I am Mrs. Blackwood, keeper of this household. You look half frozen and entirely exhausted. Come inside before you collapse upon the threshold and give me the trouble of dragging you to the fire." The warmth that greeted Eleanor as she crossed into the manor's great hall was so intense, so immediate, that she nearly wept. A fire blazed in an enormous stone hearth, its flames casting dancing shadows across walls hung with faded tapestries depicting scenes of hunting and battle. The floor was laid with rushes that smelled of rosemary and lavender, and the air carried the scent of bread baking somewhere deeper within the house. Mrs. Blackwood led her to a chair near the fire and pressed a cup of warm cider into her trembling hands. "Drink slowly. Your body has forgotten what warmth feels like, and too much too quickly will make you ill." Eleanor obeyed, sipping the cider with the careful restraint of someone who had learned that good things could be taken away as easily as they were given. The liquid spread through her chest like liquid gold, thawing the ice that had settled in her heart, alongside that in her limbs. "The position," she managed when she had recovered enough to speak. "Is it still available?" "It is." Mrs. Blackwood settled into a chair across from her, her posture as rigid as the stones that formed the walls around them. "But before we discuss terms, there are matters you must understand. Ashworth is not like other households. The master values his privacy above all things, and those who serve him must learn to ask no questions and speak of nothing they see within these walls. I am accustomed to discretion, madam. Discretion is one thing, silence is another." Mrs. Blackwood's eyes held hers with an intensity that made Eleanor's breath catch. "The master of this house has his reasons for living as he does, removed from society, forgotten by all who once knew him. He wears a mask, Miss Wren. He has worn it for as long as I have known him, and he will wear it until the day he dies. You will not ask why. You will not stare. You will not speak of it to anyone, not even to me. Is that understood?" Eleanor's heart beat faster, but she kept her face composed. A masked man, living in isolation, seeking servants through anonymous advertisements. There were 100 explanations, each more troubling than the last, but none of them changed the fundamental reality of her situation. She had nowhere else to go, no one to turn to, no future save the one she could build for herself through honest labor. "I understand," she said. Mrs. Blackwood studied her for a long moment, and something in her expression softened almost imperceptibly. "You have known hardship. I can see it in your eyes, in the way you hold yourself as though expecting a blow. This household will not give you that. The master is stern but fair, demanding but never cruel. You will work hard, but you will be treated with dignity. Can you accept those terms?" "With gratitude, madam." "Then welcome to Ashworth Manor, Miss Wren." Mrs. Blackwood rose, extending her hand not in greeting but in benediction. "May you find here whatever it is you are seeking." The room she was given was small but clean, tucked into a corner of the manor's upper floor, where the servants had once slept in greater numbers. There was a narrow bed with a mattress stuffed with clean straw, a washstand with a basin and pitcher, a small chest for her belongings, and a window that looked out over the snow-covered moors. It was more than Eleanor had possessed in years, more than she had dared to hope for, and she stood in the center of the room for a long moment, simply breathing in the reality of her new circumstance. She unpacked her meager possessions with the careful attention of someone who understood the value of small things. 2 dresses, both worn but serviceable, a comb that had belonged to her mother, a prayer book with her grandmother's name inscribed on the flyleaf, a single ribbon, blue as a summer sky, that her father had bought for her at a fair when she was 7 years old, before the plague had taken him and left her mother to struggle alone. The ribbon she placed beneath her pillow, where it would be close while she slept. That evening, she took her supper in the kitchen with Mrs. Blackwood and the cook, a stout woman named Agnes, whose cheerful demeanor seemed at odds with the somber atmosphere of the house. There was bread and cheese, thick stew with vegetables from the manor's stores, and ale that warmed Eleanor from within. The conversation was sparse but not unfriendly, and Eleanor began to feel, for the first time in years, that she might have stumbled upon something resembling safety. It was as she was returning to her room, climbing the narrow stairs with a candle in her hand, that she heard it. Footsteps. They came from above, from the tower she had glimpsed from outside, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth with the rhythm of someone lost in thought or tormented by sleeplessness. Eleanor paused on the landing, her candle flame flickering in a draft that seemed to come from nowhere, and listened. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, thick and absolute, pressing against her ears like water. Then, from somewhere in the darkness above, she heard a voice. "Who is there?" It was a man's voice, deep and resonant, carrying within it an authority that seemed to fill the very air. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to respond, to remember that she was a servant in this house, and that servants answered when they were addressed. "Eleanor Wren, my lord, the new housemaid. I did not mean to disturb you." Silence again, longer this time, stretching until Eleanor began to wonder if she had imagined the voice entirely. Then the footsteps resumed, moving not away but closer, descending the stairs from the tower with a measured tread that seemed to echo through the stone walls. He emerged from the shadows like something born of them. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in clothing that was fine but plain, the wool and leather of a country gentleman rather than the silks and velvets of the nobility. His hair was dark, falling in waves to his shoulders, and his hands, visible in the candlelight, were the hands of someone who knew labor, strong and scarred and capable. But it was the mask that held her gaze. It covered the left side of his face entirely, a smooth expanse of white material that gleamed in the flickering light like polished bone. The right side of his face was visible, revealing features that were handsome in a severe way. A strong jaw, a straight nose, an eye of such deep brown it appeared almost black. That eye regarded her now with an intensity that made her feel seen in a way she had never experienced before, as though he could look past the surface of her skin and read the secrets written upon her soul. Eleanor Wren. He spoke her name slowly, as though testing its weight upon his tongue. "Mrs. Blackwood mentioned we had a new arrival. I trust your accommodations are satisfactory?" "More than satisfactory, my lord. I am grateful for the position." "Gratitude is unnecessary. You will work, and you will be compensated. That is the nature of employment, nothing more." He paused, and something flickered in his visible eye, an emotion too swift to identify. "You are not afraid of me." It was not a question, but Eleanor answered it anyway. "No, my lord. Most are. Most take one look at this." He gestured toward the mask with a motion that held no self-pity, only statement of fact. "And flee as though they have seen the devil himself. Yet you stand there with your candle and your calm, as though I were any other man." Eleanor considered her response carefully. "I have learned, my lord, that the face a person shows the world tells us very little about who they truly are. I have known men with handsome faces and ugly souls, and I suspect the reverse is equally possible." For a long moment, he simply looked at her, and the silence between them felt different from any silence Eleanor had known before. It was not empty, but full, charged with something she could not name, something that made her skin prickle with an awareness she did not entirely understand. Then, slowly, the corner of his visible mouth curved upward in what might have been a smile. "You are either very wise or very foolish, Eleanor Wren. I have not yet determined which." He stepped past her, descending the stairs toward the lower floors. "Sleep well. Your duties begin at dawn." He was gone before she could respond, swallowed by the shadows as completely as he had emerged from them, leaving Eleanor alone with her candle and the echo of his footsteps fading into silence. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, and thought about the man in the mask, about the loneliness she had seen in his single visible eye, about the way he had spoken of being feared as though it were simply a fact of his existence, no more remarkable than the color of the sky or the fall of snow upon the moors. She thought about the secrets this house must hold, the reasons a man might choose to hide himself away from the world, and she wondered what she had stumbled into, what story she had become a part of simply by walking through the gates of Ashworth Manor. But most of all, she thought about his voice, the way it had resonated through her chest like the lowest notes of a cathedral organ, and the way she had felt, standing there in the candlelight, as though she were being seen for the first time in her life. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. These stories are crafted with love for those who believe that true connection is born from understanding, not appearance. If you want to witness how Eleanor's journey unfolds in this mysterious household, subscribe now so you never miss a moment of this tale. The days that followed settled into a rhythm as steady as the beating of a heart. Eleanor rose before dawn, dressed in the simple gray dress that Mrs. Blackwood had provided, and descended to the kitchen where Agnes was already at work, kneading bread by the light of tallow candles while the fire crackled in the great hearth. There was porridge for breakfast, thick and warm, sweetened with honey from the manor's own hives, and then the work began. Ashworth Manor was larger than it appeared from outside, a labyrinth of corridors and chambers that seemed to have grown organically over centuries of habitation. There were rooms that had not been opened in years, their furniture draped in white cloths like ghosts waiting to be summoned, and passages that led to cellars and storerooms filled with the accumulated possessions of generations. Eleanor learned the layout slowly, guided by Mrs. Blackwood's patient instruction and her own curiosity, mapping the manor in her mind like a cartographer charting unknown territory. The master of the house remained largely invisible. She caught glimpses of him sometimes, crossing a courtyard or disappearing around a corner, always moving with that same measured tread she had heard on her first night. He took his meals alone in his study, a room in the tower that was strictly off-limits to all but Mrs. Blackwood, and he spent his days engaged in pursuits that Eleanor could only guess at, reading, writing, or simply staring out at the frozen landscape that surrounded his domain. She learned his name from Agnes during a quiet moment in the kitchen, when the cook was feeling talkative and the afternoon light slanted through the windows like liquid gold. "Lord Marcus Ashworth," Agnes said, rolling out pastry with practiced hands. "Though he don't use the title, not anymore. Just calls himself Mr. Ashworth, as though he were a common merchant or tradesman. The old lord, his father, would turn in his grave if he knew. Why doesn't he use his title?" Agnes shrugged, but her eyes grew distant, touched by a sadness that seemed to run deeper than mere gossip. "That's not for me to say, child. What I can tell you is that he wasn't always as you see him now. When I first came to this house, 30 years past, he was a boy of 10, bright and laughing and full of mischief, the handsomest child you ever saw, with his mother's eyes and his father's spirit. Everyone said he would be a great lord, that he would bring honor to the Ashworth name. What happened?" The cook's hand stilled upon the pastry. "Life happened, child. The same thing that happens to all of us sooner or later. He went away to war, fighting for the crown in France, and when he came back..." She shook her head. "He wasn't the same. None of them ever are, I suppose. But him especially. He came back with that mask upon his face and that silence in his heart, and he's worn both ever since." Eleanor absorbed this information in silence, adding it to the growing collection of fragments she had gathered about the man who employed her. A lord who refused his title, a soldier who had returned from war changed beyond recognition, a man who hid his face from the world and lived in isolation, surrounded by servants who spoke of him in whispers and guarded his secrets like sacred relics. She should have been satisfied with what she knew. She should have followed Mrs. Blackwood's instructions, asking no questions and speaking of nothing she observed. But there was something in Eleanor that had never been good at accepting mystery, a hunger for understanding that had been born in childhood and had only grown stronger with the years of hardship that followed. It was this hunger that drove her to the tower on the evening of her 3rd week at Ashworth. She had been sent to deliver a letter that had arrived that afternoon, a rare piece of correspondence that Mrs. Blackwood had received with visible surprise. The housekeeper was occupied with matters in the kitchen, and she had entrusted Eleanor with the task, pressing the sealed envelope into her hands with instructions to knock upon the study door and leave the letter on the threshold if there was no response. Eleanor climbed the tower stairs with the letter clutched against her chest, her heart beating faster with each step. She had not been this close to the master's private domain since her first night, and the air seemed to grow thicker as she ascended, charged with the same strange electricity she had felt during their initial encounter. She reached the door and raised her hand to knock. Before her knuckles could connect with the wood, the door swung open. He stood before her in shirt sleeves, his mask in place, his dark hair disheveled as though he had been running his fingers through it in frustration. Behind him, she caught a glimpse of the study. Walls lined with books, a desk covered in papers, a fire burning low in a grate that had not been tended in hours. "Miss Wren." His voice carried that same resonance she remembered, but there was something different in it now, a weariness that had not been present before. "You have a letter for me." "Yes, my lord." She extended the envelope and he took it from her fingers, his hand brushing against hers in the process. The contact lasted less than a second, but Eleanor felt it like a brand upon her skin. His fingers were warm despite the cold that permeated the tower, and there was a gentleness in his touch that seemed at odds with everything she had been told about him. He examined the seal, and something in his expression shifted. "This is from the Duke of Norfolk." He spoke the name as though it were a curse, weighted with history and bitterness. "I wonder what he wants from me now. Shall I leave you to read it, my lord?" "No." The word was sharp, almost reflexive, and he seemed to catch himself, softening his tone with visible effort. "Forgive me. I am not accustomed to company. Stay a moment, if you will. I may require a response to be carried." He retreated into the study, leaving the door open in what Eleanor understood to be an invitation. She followed him cautiously, crossing the threshold into a room that felt like entering another world. The study was chaos made manifest. Books were stacked in precarious towers upon every surface, their spines cracked from use, their pages bristling with scraps of paper marking passages of particular interest. Maps hung upon the walls alongside sketches of military formations and architectural plans for buildings Eleanor did not recognize. A chess set sat upon a table near the window, its pieces frozen in the midst of a game against an opponent who existed only in the master's mind. And everywhere there were candles, dozens of them, in holders of silver and brass and simple clay, their flames casting a warm glow that softened the austerity of the stone walls and transformed the room into something almost magical. Lord Ashworth settled into the chair behind his desk and broke the seal upon the letter with a knife that gleamed in the candlelight. His eye moved across the words within, and Eleanor watched as his expression progressed through a series of changes. Surprise, then anger, then something that looked almost like despair. "The Duke requires my presence at court," he said at last, setting the letter down with the careful precision of someone resisting the urge to crumple it into a ball. "He claims there are matters of the estate that require my personal attention, debts that have come due, contracts that require my signature. He knows I will not come, and yet he summons me anyway. It is a game to him, a way of reminding me that I cannot hide forever. Forgive me, my lord, but—" Eleanor hesitated, uncertain whether she was overstepping the boundaries of her position. "If you do not wish to go, surely you can simply refuse." "Refuse a duke?" He laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You do not understand the world of nobility, Miss Wren. A man may refuse a request from an equal, but a summons from a duke is tantamount to a command from the king himself. To refuse is to invite consequences that extend far beyond personal inconvenience." "Then you will go?" "I have no choice." He rose from the chair, moving to the window where the last light of day was bleeding across the horizon in shades of crimson and gold. "But I will not go as the man they remember. I will not remove this mask, not for the Duke of Norfolk, not for anyone. Let them see what their war has made of me. Let them face the consequences of their own commands." There was such bitterness in his voice, such barely contained rage, that Eleanor found herself speaking without thought. "What happened to you, my lord?" The words hung in the air between them, irretrievable, impossible to take back. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as she realized what she had done, how thoroughly she had violated the one rule she had been given, the one promise she had made. Lord Ashworth turned from the window, and his single visible eye fixed upon her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You wish to know?" His voice was soft now, almost gentle, which somehow made it more frightening than if he had shouted. "You wish to know what lies beneath this mask? What horror I hide from the world? My lord, I apologize. I should not have spoken— No!" He crossed the room toward her, and Eleanor stood her ground through sheer force of will, refusing to retreat even as every instinct screamed at her to flee. "You asked a question, Miss Wren. It is only fair that you receive an answer." He stopped before her, close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corner of his eye, the silver threads just beginning to appear in his dark hair, the way his chest rose and fell with breaths that were not quite steady. "I was 23 years old when I followed my father to France," he said. "A boy playing at being a soldier, convinced that war was an adventure, that glory awaited those brave enough to seek it. I believed the songs and the stories. I believed that honor meant something, that the causes we fought for were just and righteous. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to barely more than a whisper. I was wrong. War is not glory, Miss Wren. It is mud and blood, and the screams of dying men. It is watching your friends fall beside you and knowing that their deaths mean nothing, that the land you fight for will change hands a dozen times before the conflict ends, that the lords who sent you to die will never know your names or mourn your passing. My lord, I survived a siege that should have killed me, he continued, as though she had not spoken. I was trapped in a burning tower, and when I finally escaped, half my face was gone, burned away, melted like wax in a flame. The physicians who treated me said it was a miracle I lived at all, and perhaps they were right. But sometimes I wonder if death would have been kinder than this half-life I have been condemned to lead. He raised his hand toward his mask, and for a moment Eleanor thought he would remove it, would show her the horror he had described. But his fingers stopped short of the white surface, trembling slightly, and then fell back to his side. Now you know, he said. Now you understand why I hide myself away, why I cannot bear the stares and whispers of a world that sees only the monster and never the man beneath. Are you satisfied, Miss Wren? Has your curiosity been appeased? Eleanor looked at him, at the pain that radiated from his visible eye like heat from a flame, at the tension in his shoulders and the way his hands had curled into fists at his sides. She thought of all the platitudes she could offer, the empty words of comfort that would mean nothing to a man who had suffered as he had. Instead, she said simply, I see no monster, my lord. I see only a man who has endured more than anyone should be asked to bear. For a long moment, he did not speak. Then slowly, the tension in his shoulders began to ease, and something that might have been gratitude flickered in his eye. You are a remarkable woman, Eleanor Wren, he said quietly, far more remarkable than you know. He turned back to his desk, picking up the letter from the Duke with hands that no longer trembled. I will need you to prepare for a journey. We leave for London in 3 days' time. Mrs. Blackwood will accompany me, as will you. Me, my lord? You. He looked at her over his shoulder, and there was something new in his gaze, something that made her heart beat faster for reasons she could not quite name. I find that I require the presence of someone who is not afraid to speak the truth to me, even when that truth is uncomfortable. You have demonstrated that quality admirably, Miss Wren. I suspect I shall have need of it in the days to come. The road to London was long and treacherous, winding through frozen forests and across rivers swollen with snowmelt. They traveled in a covered wagon, its wooden sides reinforced against the elements, drawn by 4 sturdy horses that plodded through the mud and ice with patient determination. Lord Ashworth rode alongside on a black stallion, his cloak billowing behind him, his masked face turned toward the horizon as though seeking something only he could see. Eleanor sat inside the wagon with Mrs. Blackwood, watching the countryside pass through gaps in the canvas covering. The land was beautiful in its desolation, all rolling hills and ancient forests, dotted with villages where smoke rose from thatched roofs and children stopped their play to stare as the small procession passed. She had never traveled so far from the north, had never imagined she would see the parts of England that existed only in stories and songs. And despite the discomfort of the journey, she found herself marveling at the world beyond the boundaries of her previous existence. Mrs. Blackwood was less impressed. The housekeeper had made her feelings about the journey clear from the moment Lord Ashworth had announced his intentions, arguing that it was foolish to travel in winter, that the roads were dangerous, that the Duke of Norfolk could wait until spring. But the master had been immovable, and so here they were, bouncing along rutted roads toward a destination that filled the older woman with visible apprehension. You should prepare yourself, Mrs. Blackwood said on the 3rd day of travel, as the wagon crested a hill and the first distant glimpse of London appeared on the horizon. The court is nothing like Ashworth. The people there are vipers dressed in silk, all smiles and poisoned words. They will look at you and see a servant, nothing more, and they will treat you accordingly. I am accustomed to being overlooked, Eleanor replied. It is often an advantage. Perhaps. But you must also be prepared for what they will say about him. Mrs. Blackwood's voice dropped, though there was no one nearby to overhear. The stories that circulate in noble circles are not kind. They call him the masked duke, the monster of Ashworth, the beast of the north. Some claim his face was cursed by a witch. Others say he made a bargain with the devil and bears the mark of that transaction. None of them remember the boy he was, or care about the man he has become. Why do you tell me this? Mrs. Blackwood's eyes met hers with an intensity that bordered on fierce. Because I have watched you these past weeks, Miss Wren. I have seen how you look at him, how you speak to him without fear, how he responds to you in ways he has not responded to anyone in years. I do not know what is growing between you, but I know that he will need your strength in the days to come. The court will try to break him. They have tried before. He must not face that alone. Eleanor absorbed this in silence, her mind turning over the implications of the housekeeper's words. She had not allowed herself to examine her feelings for Lord Ashworth too closely, had not permitted herself to consider what it meant that her heart beat faster when he entered a room, that she found herself listening for his footsteps in the corridors of the manor, that his voice haunted her dreams in ways that were decidedly improper for a servant to dream of her master. But Mrs. Blackwood had seen it. Perhaps others had as well. And now Eleanor was forced to confront what she had been trying to deny. She cared for him. Not as a servant cares for a kind employer, but as a woman cares for a man she is beginning to love. The realization should have frightened her. In the world she inhabited, such feelings could lead only to heartbreak. Lords did not marry servants, and the alternative, becoming a mistress, was a path that led to ruin and disgrace. But Eleanor had never been good at protecting her heart, had never learned to guard against feelings that arose unbidden and demanded to be felt. She would deal with the consequences when they came. For now, she would focus on the task at hand, surviving the court, and helping Lord Ashworth survive it as well. They arrived in London on the 7th day, passing through gates that had stood for centuries, and entering a city that seemed to pulse with life despite the winter cold. The streets were crowded with merchants and beggars, nobles in fine carriages, and commoners hauling carts through the mud. The smell was overwhelming. Smoke and sewage, roasting meat and rotting vegetables, perfume and sweat all mingled together in a miasma that made Eleanor's eyes water. The Duke of Norfolk's residence was a palace in all but name, a sprawling complex of stone and timber that occupied an entire block near the river. They were received by servants in livery more fine than any clothing Eleanor had ever worn, and ushered through corridors hung with tapestries depicting the Duke's ancestors in scenes of triumph and glory. Lord Ashworth walked ahead, his spine rigid, his masked face betraying nothing. But Eleanor, who had learned to read the tension in his shoulders and the set of his jaw, could see the effort it cost him to maintain his composure. He was walking into the lion's den, surrounded by enemies who would use any sign of weakness against him, and the only armor he possessed was the mask upon his face and the dignity he refused to surrender. The Duke received them in a great hall where a fire blazed in a hearth large enough to roast an ox. He was an older man, perhaps 60, with silver hair and a face that might once have been handsome, but had settled into an expression of perpetual calculation. His eyes, small and sharp, fixed upon Lord Ashworth's mask with undisguised curiosity. "Ashworth," he said, rising from his chair with a grace that belied his years. "It has been too long. I was beginning to think you had forgotten your obligations to the crown." "I forget nothing, Your Grace." Lord Ashworth's voice was steady, revealing nothing of the turmoil Eleanor knew churned beneath his composed exterior. "You summoned me regarding matters of the estate. I am here. What do you require?" The Duke smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Straight to business, as always." "Very well. There is the matter of your taxes, which have been in arrears for 3 years now, and the matter of your marriage, which has been in arrears for considerably longer." "My marriage?" "You are the last of your line, Ashworth. The Ashworth name will die with you unless you produce an heir, and you cannot produce an heir without a wife." The Duke gestured toward a doorway at the far end of the hall. "I have taken the liberty of identifying a suitable candidate, Lady Catherine Beaumont, daughter of the Earl of Wessex. She is young, beautiful, and comes with a dowry that would resolve your financial difficulties entirely. Eleanor felt something cold settle in her chest, a sensation she recognized as jealousy even as she despised herself for feeling it. Of course he would marry. Of course a duke, even a duke who hid his face from the world, would be expected to take a wife and produce heirs. She was a fool for having allowed herself to hope for anything different. Lord Ashworth was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was measured, controlled. "I was not aware that my marriage was among your concerns, Your Grace." "Everything about the noble families of England is my concern, Ashworth. The king himself has expressed interest in seeing you wed. He remembers the service your father provided during the French campaigns, and he wishes to see the Ashworth line continue." The Duke's smile widened. "Besides, it would be a shame to let such a fine estate fall into the hands of distant cousins who have done nothing to earn it." "And Lady Catherine? What does she know of me?" "She knows that you are a duke, that you are wealthy, and that you have the king's favor. What more does a woman need to know?" Eleanor watched Lord Ashworth's hands clench at his sides, saw the slight tremor that passed through his frame before he brought it under control. She wanted to speak, to say something that would ease his burden, but she knew her place. She was a servant in a hall of nobles, invisible and voiceless, and any word she spoke would only make things worse. It was then that Lady Catherine entered. She was beautiful, there was no denying it. 18 years old, with hair the color of spun gold and eyes of the palest blue. Her dress was silk, embroidered with flowers and birds, and she moved with the graceful precision of someone trained from birth to command attention and admiration. She looked like a princess from a fairy tale, perfect and untouchable. And when her eyes fell upon Lord Ashworth's masked face, they widened only slightly before her training reasserted itself, and her expression became one of polite interest. "Lord Ashworth," she said, curtsying with practiced elegance, "it is an honor to meet you. My father has spoken highly of your family." "Lady Catherine." Lord Ashworth bowed, but his voice was distant, formal. "The honor is mine." The Duke beamed with satisfaction. "Excellent. You will dine together this evening, and we shall discuss the arrangements. I trust you will find each other's company agreeable." He spoke as though the matter were already settled, as though the marriage were a fait accompli requiring only the formalities of negotiation. And perhaps, Eleanor thought, it was. This was how the nobility lived, their marriages arranged for politics and profit, their hearts irrelevant to the calculations of power. She should be happy for him. She should be glad that he would have a beautiful wife and heirs to carry on his name. She should accept that her feelings were foolish, inappropriate, doomed from the start. But as she watched Lady Catherine take Lord Ashworth's arm and lead him toward the dining hall, Eleanor felt something inside her crack, a fissure in the wall she had built around her heart. She turned away, fighting to keep her composure, and nearly collided with a man who had appeared behind her without a sound. He was young, perhaps 25, with dark hair and a face that was handsome in a sharp, angular way. His clothing was fine, his bearing that of nobility, but there was something in his eyes that made Eleanor's skin prickle with unease. "You are Ashworth's servant," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, my lord." "Interesting." He studied her with an intensity that felt like being examined by a predator. "I am Lord Geoffrey Blackwell, cousin to the Duke. I could not help but notice the way you looked at your master just now. One might almost think you had feelings for him." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her face composed. "I am sure I do not know what you mean, my lord. I serve Lord Ashworth as any servant would serve her master." "Of course you do." Lord Geoffrey's smile did not reach his eyes. "A word of advice, girl. The masked duke is not what he appears to be. There are secrets in that house of his, secrets that would curdle your blood if you knew them. You would do well to distance yourself before those secrets consume you as well." He walked away before she could respond, leaving Eleanor alone in the corridor with the echo of his words and the cold certainty that she had just made an enemy without understanding why. That night, As the nobles dined and drank and discussed arrangements that would determine Lord Ashworth's future, Eleanor sat in the servants' quarters and tried to make sense of what she had witnessed. Lady Catherine was everything a lord could want in a wife: beautiful, wealthy, connected to powerful families. Lord Ashworth would be a fool to refuse such a match, and whatever feelings Eleanor might harbor, they were irrelevant to the calculations of politics and power. And yet she could not forget the way he had looked at her in the tower, the way his voice had softened when he spoke her name, the way he had asked her to accompany him on this journey when any other servant would have served just as well. There was something between them, something that defied the boundaries of class and station, something that whispered of possibilities she dared not name. She was still wrestling with these thoughts when the door opened and Lord Ashworth entered. He looked exhausted, the weariness visible in every line of his body. His mask was still in place, but even that seemed somehow diminished, as though the weight of the evening had worn away at the armor he presented to the world. Miss Wren. He stopped just inside the doorway, as though uncertain whether he was welcome. I hoped I might find you here. My lord. She rose, smoothing her skirts with hands that trembled slightly. How was the dinner? Interminable. He moved to the window, looking out at the London night. Lady Catherine is everything the Duke promised: young, beautiful, accomplished. She would make any man a fine wife. Then you will accept the match? He was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I cannot. My lord? He turned to face her, and in his visible eye she saw something that made her breath catch. Vulnerability, raw and unguarded, stripped of all the defenses he had built around himself. I cannot marry a woman who looks at my mask and sees only the mystery beneath it. I cannot spend my life with someone who will never know the man I truly am, who will share my bed and bear my children while remaining a stranger to my soul. He took a step toward her, then another. I have lived in isolation for 10 years, Miss Wren. I have accepted loneliness as the price of my disfigurement. But in these past weeks, I have begun to wonder if perhaps I was wrong. My lord, You see me. His voice cracked on the words. Not the mask, not the title, not the monster the world believes me to be. You see the man beneath, the man I had forgotten existed. And I find that I cannot bear the thought of returning to a life where no one sees me at all. Eleanor's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. What are you saying? I am saying that I am a fool. He reached out, and his fingers brushed her cheek with a gentleness that brought tears to her eyes. I am saying that I have fallen in love with a servant girl who speaks to me without fear and looks at me without pity. I am saying that I would rather face the scorn of every noble in England than spend my life married to a woman I do not love. The moment stretched between them, fragile as spun glass. Eleanor knew she should step back, should remind him of the impossibility of what he was suggesting, should protect them both from the heartbreak that would surely follow. Instead, she leaned into his touch and whispered, I love you too. If you are feeling the power of this moment, if your heart is beating alongside Eleanor's, leave a comment right now saying, Love sees beyond all masks. Let me know you are here, living this story with me. The days that followed were a tempest of whispered conversations and stolen glances. Lord Ashworth informed the Duke that he could not accept Lady Catherine's hand, citing reasons of conscience that he refused to elaborate upon. The Duke was furious, threatening consequences that ranged from financial ruin to social exile, but Lord Ashworth remained unmoved. Let them do their worst, he told Eleanor in a quiet moment between confrontations. I have already lost everything that matters once. I will not lose it again by surrendering the one thing I have left, my right to choose my own fate. But the Duke was not a man accustomed to being refused. On the 4th night of their stay in London, he summoned Lord Ashworth to a gathering of nobles, a salon where the most powerful families of England had assembled to witness what the Duke promised would be a revelation of great importance. Eleanor accompanied her lord to the gathering, standing in the shadows with the other servants while the nobility swirled around them in silks and velvets. Lady Catherine was there, looking subdued and uncertain, and Lord Geoffrey Blackwell lurked near the edges of the room, his sharp eyes watching everything. The Duke rose to address the assembly, and his voice carried the satisfaction of a man who believed himself victorious. "My friends, I have gathered you here tonight to address a matter of great concern to the realm. Among us stands a man who has hidden himself from society for 10 years, who has refused the honors and obligations of his station, who has allowed rumor and speculation to flourish where truth should reign." He turned toward Lord Ashworth, and his smile was predatory. "It is time, I think, for the mystery to end. It is time for us all to see what lies beneath the mask of the Duke of Ashworth." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Lord Ashworth stood frozen, his hands clenched at his sides, his single visible eye burning with barely contained rage. "You have no right," he began. "I have every right." The Duke's voice hardened. "You are a peer of this realm, Ashworth. Your face belongs to your king and your country. Remove the mask, or I will have it removed for you." The silence that followed was absolute. Eleanor watched as Lord Ashworth's shoulders rose and fell with breaths that were not quite steady, as his hands trembled with the effort of controlling his fury. She wanted to go to him, to stand at his side, but she knew that any action she took would only make things worse. And then, slowly, Lord Ashworth raised his hands to his face. "You wish to see what lies beneath." His voice was calm now, terribly calm, the calm of a man who has made peace with his fate. "Very well. Let the truth be known." He removed the mask. The gasps that echoed through the room were like a physical blow. Eleanor forced herself to look, to see what he had hidden for so long, and what she saw made her heart ache with a grief she had not known she was capable of feeling. The left side of his face was a ruin of scarred tissue, the skin melted and reformed into ridges and valleys that bore no resemblance to human features. His eye on that side was gone, replaced by a socket of twisted flesh that had healed closed. The damage extended from his hairline to his jaw, a permanent testament to the fire that had nearly claimed his life. But Eleanor saw something else as well. She saw the courage it had taken to stand before his tormentors and reveal his deepest shame. She saw the dignity he maintained even as the nobles around him recoiled in horror. She saw the man she loved more clearly than she had ever seen him before. The Duke laughed, a cruel sound that cut through the silence like a blade. "Now you understand why he hides himself away. Who could bear to look upon such a face? Who could love such a monster?" "I could." The words were out before Eleanor could stop them, ringing through the hall with a clarity that surprised even her. Every eye turned toward her, and she felt the weight of their judgment like a physical force, but she did not falter. She walked forward, past the staring nobles, past Lady Catherine's shocked face, past Lord Geoffrey's calculating gaze, until she stood before Lord Ashworth. She reached up and touched his ruined cheek, feeling the ridges of scarred tissue beneath her fingers, and she smiled. "I could love such a face," she said softly. "I do love such a face. Because this face belongs to the bravest, kindest, most honorable man I have ever known. And if loving him makes me a fool in your eyes, then I will wear that title with pride." Lord Ashworth stared at her, and in his remaining eye she saw tears gathering, tears he had probably not shed in years. "Eleanor, you asked me once if I was wise or foolish." She took his hand in hers, interlacing their fingers. "I believe I have my answer now. The scandal that erupted in the wake of that evening should have destroyed them both." A servant declaring her love for a duke standing before the nobility with his disfigurement exposed, it was the sort of thing that fueled gossip for generations. But something unexpected happened. Lady Catherine, watching Eleanor's declaration with wide eyes, stepped forward before the Duke could respond. Her voice, when she spoke, carried a strength that surprised everyone who heard it. "The Duke of Norfolk does not speak for me," she said. "I was brought here as a pawn in a political game, offered to a man I had never met for reasons that had nothing to do with my heart or my wishes. But I have eyes, and I have seen something tonight that I did not expect to see." She looked at Eleanor, and there was something like admiration in her gaze. "I have seen true love, and I will not be party to destroying it." The murmurs that rippled through the crowd now carried a different tone. Lady Catherine was the daughter of an earl, a woman of impeccable reputation, and her words carried weight that Eleanor's never could. The Duke's face darkened with fury. "You forget yourself, Lady Catherine. This is a matter of—" "This is a matter of the heart." A new voice entered the conversation, and Eleanor turned to see an elderly woman rising from her chair near the fire. She was dressed in black velvet, her white hair crowned with a circlet of gold, and she moved with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "And matters of the heart are not for men like you to decide, Norfolk." "Your Grace." The Duke's voice had changed, becoming deferential, almost fearful. "I did not realize—" "No, you did not." The woman crossed the room to stand before Lord Ashworth, examining his ruined face with eyes that held no horror, only assessment. "I knew your father, young Marcus. He was a good man, and he spoke of you often. He would be proud of what you have become. Your Grace, you have hidden yourself away for too long." She reached up and touched his scarred cheek, just as Eleanor had done moments before. "War takes many things from us, but it need not take our capacity for love. This woman sees your worth. That is not something to be ashamed of. That is something to be celebrated." She turned to address the room, and her voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "I am the Duchess of Lancaster, and I speak with the voice of the crown. Lord Ashworth has served this realm with honor and sacrifice. His choice of bride is his own to make, and any who speak against it speak against me." The silence that followed was different from the silences that had come before. It was the silence of power shifting, of alliances recalculating, of a room full of people realizing that they had been on the wrong side of history. The Duke of Norfolk bowed stiffly and retreated. Lord Geoffrey Blackwell slipped away without a word, and Lady Catherine, catching Eleanor's eye across the room, smiled and nodded in what could only be interpreted as blessing. Later that night, in the privacy of their chambers, Lord Ashworth took Eleanor's hands in his and looked at her with an expression of wonder and disbelief. "You could have remained silent," he said. "You could have protected yourself. Let them believe you were nothing more than a servant. Why did you speak?" "Because some things are worth more than safety." She squeezed his fingers gently. "Because I have spent my entire life being invisible, and I finally found someone who sees me. I could not stand by and watch them hurt you, not when I had the power to stop it. They will never accept you. The nobility, the court, they will always see you as beneath me. Let them." She lifted his hand to her lips and kissed his scarred knuckles. "Their acceptance means nothing to me. Only yours." He pulled her into his arms, holding her against his chest as though she were something precious, something he had never expected to find. "I do not deserve you, Eleanor Wren." "Perhaps not." She smiled against his shoulder. "But you have me nonetheless." Spring arrived in the north of England like a promise kept after long delay. The snow melted from the moors, revealing carpets of green beneath, and the first flowers began to push through the soil around Ashworth Manor. Birds returned to the forests, filling the air with songs that had been absent through the long winter months, and the sun climbed higher each day, warming the gray stone walls until they seemed almost to glow. Eleanor stood at the window of the chamber she now shared with her husband, watching the transformation of the landscape she had first seen buried in ice. 3 months had passed since their wedding, a quiet ceremony performed in the chapel at Ashworth with only Mrs. Blackwood and Agnes as witnesses. There had been no grand celebration, no noble guests, no political alliances sealed with their union. There had been only 2 people promising to love each other for the rest of their lives, and that had been enough. Lord Ashworth, Marcus, as she now called him in private, had removed his mask on their wedding night and had not worn it since. The scars remained, would always remain, but they no longer seemed like something to hide. They were simply part of him, like the color of his eyes or the timbre of his voice, and Eleanor had long since stopped seeing them as anything other than the face of the man she loved. The Duke of Norfolk had retreated into sullen silence after his humiliation at court. Lady Catherine had married a young baron of her own choosing, a love match that had scandalized her family almost as much as Eleanor's had scandalized the nobility. And Lord Geoffrey Blackwell had disappeared from society entirely, rumored to have fled to the continent to escape debts that had finally caught up with him. As for Eleanor, she had become the Duchess of Ashworth, a title that still felt foreign on her tongue, but was slowly becoming familiar. She had taken over management of the household from Mrs. Blackwood, who remained as advisor and friend, and had begun the work of restoring Ashworth Manor to its former glory. There were gardens to replant, rooms to renovate, a community to rebuild. It was work that would take years, perhaps decades, but it was work that gave her purpose and joy. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Marcus crossing the room, his face soft with the expression he wore only when they were alone. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder as he gazed out at the view she had been contemplating. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "The future." She leaned back against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her spine. "All the years that stretch ahead of us. All the things we will build together." "It frightens me sometimes," he admitted. "I spent so long convinced that I would die alone, that I would be the end of my family's line. Now I have you, and everything has changed, and I do not always know how to navigate this new world. We will learn together." She turned in his arms, cupping his scarred cheek in her palm. "That is what marriage is it not? Two people learning to face the world together, supporting each other through the difficulties, celebrating together through the joys." He kissed her then, slow and tender, and when he pulled back, there were tears in his eye. "I love you, Eleanor, more than I have words to express. You saw past my mask when no one else would look. You gave me back my life. And you gave me a home." She smiled up at him, feeling the warmth of the spring sun on her back and the warmth of his love in her heart. "That makes us even, I think." They stood together at the window, watching as the first butterflies of spring emerged from the hedgerows and began their dance across the reborn gardens. In the distance, the sound of children's laughter drifted up from the village, and Eleanor placed her hand over her stomach, where a new life was just beginning to grow. She had not told him yet. She was waiting for the right moment, the perfect confluence of time and place and emotion. But she knew already how he would react. With wonder, with joy, with tears, he would not try to hide. Their child would grow up in a home filled with love, would never know the loneliness that had marked both their early lives, would inherit a legacy not of isolation, but of courage and compassion. The Masked Duke, they still called him in the villages beyond Ashworth's borders. The monster of the north, the beast who had emerged from war with a face that frightened children. But Eleanor knew the truth. She knew that behind the scars and the reputation lay a heart of extraordinary tenderness, a soul that had been wounded but never broken. A man who had learned that love was not about appearances, but about seeing and being seen. And as the spring sun climbed higher over Ashworth Manor, as the new season unfurled its green banners across the moors, Eleanor closed her eyes and breathed in the scent of flowers and fresh earth and possibility. She had come to this place as a servant, fleeing a life of hardship and despair. She would remain as its duchess, its healer, its heart. And in the arms of the man she loved, she had finally found the one thing she had been searching for all along, a place where she truly belonged. The great hall of Ashworth Manor blazed with candlelight, its stones scrubbed clean, and its tapestries restored to their former glory. A fire roared in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across walls that had known too many years of darkness and silence. And in the center of the room, surrounded by the household staff who had become her family, Eleanor sat with her daughter cradled in her arms. They had named her Rose, for the flowers that had begun to bloom in the manor's gardens on the day of her birth. She had her father's dark hair and her mother's gray eyes, and when she smiled, which was often, she lit up the room more brilliantly than any candle. Marcus sat beside his wife, one arm around her shoulders, the other reaching down to touch his daughter's tiny hand. His face was bare, as it always was now within the walls of his home, and the scars that marked it seemed less like wounds than like badges of honor, testaments to survival and resilience. Mrs. Blackwood stood nearby, her stern features softened by an expression that could only be described as grandmotherly pride. Agnes wiped tears from her eyes as she watched the small family, remembering the laughing boy Marcus had been, and seeing echoes of that boy in the man he had become. Even Samuel, the taciturn groundskeeper, had come inside for the occasion, his weathered face creased with a rare smile. "She will be a great lady," Mrs. Blackwood said, her voice thick with emotion. "I knew it the moment I saw her. She has her mother's spirit and her father's strength." "She will be whatever she chooses to be," Eleanor replied, pressing a kiss to her daughter's forehead. "That is the gift we give her, the freedom to write her own story." Marcus tightened his arm around her shoulders. "You have given me so much, Eleanor. A wife who sees me as I am, a daughter who will grow up knowing she is loved, a home that is finally filled with light instead of shadows." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was rough with feeling. "I spent 10 years believing I was a monster. You showed me I was a man." "You were always a man," she said softly. "You simply forgot for a while. I was just the one who reminded you." Outside, the summer sun was setting over the moors, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose and lavender. The gardens Eleanor had planted were in full bloom, their fragrance drifting through open windows and filling the manor with the scent of new beginnings. And in the village beyond the gates, lights were beginning to appear in windows as families gathered for their evening meals, secure in the knowledge that the Lord of Ashworth was no longer a figure of fear, but a protector and a friend. Eleanor looked around at the faces of those she loved, at the home she had helped to rebuild, at the future that stretched before her like an unwritten page. She thought of the frightened girl who had walked through Ashworth's gates in the depths of winter, seeking nothing more than shelter and safety. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, the trials she had faced, the love she had found in the most unexpected of places. And she smiled, because she knew that every step of that journey, every hardship and every joy had led her exactly where she was meant to be. In the arms of a man the world had feared, in a home that had been waiting for her all along, in a life that was, at last, truly her own. If you watched until the end, it is because this story touched your heart. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can meet you and know who truly loves the stories on this channel. And if Eleanor and Marcus's journey made you believe in the power of love that sees beyond appearances, please leave a like and share this video with someone who needs to hear this message today. Check if you are already subscribed and click the notification bell. Every week, new stories of courage, redemption, and love await you here. Your subscription helps this channel continue bringing tales that warm the soul and remind us that true beauty is never found on the surface. It is found in the hearts of those brave enough to love without masks. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Until the next story.